The arrival. Marcus Chen had been alone on Lunar Station Omega-7 for 3 years, 4 months, and 16 days. Not that he was counting. Well, actually, he was counting, but only because the station's computer reminded him every morning during his routine systems check. The isolation hadn't driven him mad like the psychologists back on Earth had warned it might. Instead, it had given him something he'd never had before: perfect, uninterrupted peace. The mining station orbited the moon's dark side, harvesting rare Earth elements from asteroid fragments caught in lunar gravity. It was supposed to be a two-person operation, but his partner, Rodriguez, had suffered a medical emergency 18 months into their deployment. The emergency evacuation ship had taken Rodriguez back to Earth, leaving Marcus with a choice: abandon the station and lose 2 years of mining progress, or stay alone and complete the mission. Marcus had chosen to stay. The company had protested, citing safety regulations and psychological concerns, but Marcus had threatened to quit if they didn't let him finish the job. Mining operations like this one were his specialty, and he'd worked too hard to let some corporate bureaucrats shut him down over their fears about solitude. He'd grown to love the silence. No small talk, no forced conversations over meals, no one asking him how his day was going. Just him, the hum of the life support systems, and the vast emptiness of space beyond the station's reinforced windows. He could work at his own pace, eat when he wanted, sleep when he was tired, and spend his free time reading the extensive digital library he downloaded before the mission. The station itself was a marvel of human engineering. Built like a massive wheel, it rotated slowly to create artificial gravity in the outer rings where the living quarters and laboratories were located. The central hub housed the docking bay, storage areas, and the main computer core. Solar panels and fusion reactors provided power, while automated systems maintained the delicate balance of atmosphere, temperature, and pressure that kept Marcus alive in the hostile environment of space. On the morning when everything changed, Marcus was performing his usual routine. He woke at precisely 0600 hours, as he had every day for the past 3 years. The automated systems had already prepared his breakfast: synthetic eggs, reconstituted orange juice, and coffee made from beans that had been freeze-dried and compressed into small cubes. The taste wasn't perfect, but it was familiar and comforting. After breakfast, he began his daily inspection of the station. He checked the atmospheric processors, tested the gravity generators, monitored the mining equipment, and reviewed the night's automated collection data. Everything was running smoothly, as it always did. The station had been built to operate with minimal human intervention, and Marcus had become an expert at maintaining the few systems that still required manual oversight. It was during his inspection of the external sensors that he first noticed something unusual. The long-range scanners were detecting multiple objects approaching the station. At first, Marcus assumed they were asteroids or space debris, but the objects were moving in formation and appeared to be under some form of intelligent control. He pulled up the detailed sensor readings on his workstation. 10 objects, each roughly the size of a small spacecraft, were approaching from the direction of deep space. Their heat signatures were organic rather than mechanical, and they seemed to be alive. Marcus frowned at the display. The readings didn't match any known Earth technology or alien species that humanity had encountered in their expansion into space. As the objects drew closer, the station's external cameras began to pick up visual data. Marcus stared at the monitor in disbelief. The approaching creatures looked like dragons from ancient Earth mythology. They had long, serpentine bodies covered in scales that seemed to shimmer with their own inner light. Massive wings carried them through the vacuum of space with impossible grace, and their eyes glowed like stars in the darkness. Marcus rubbed his eyes and looked again, certain that the isolation had finally affected his mind. But the creatures were still there, real and undeniable. They moved through space as if it were air, their wings beating in slow, powerful strokes that somehow propelled them forward despite the lack of atmosphere. Bioluminescent patterns ran along their bodies, pulsing in complex rhythms that might have been some form of communication. The lead dragon was larger than the others, its scales a deep crimson that seemed to absorb and reflect light simultaneously. Behind it flew 9 smaller dragons in various colors: deep blue, emerald green, golden yellow, pure white, jet black, silver, bronze, violet, and one that seemed to shift between multiple colors like an aurora. As they approached the station, Marcus could see that they were not in good condition. Their flight patterns were erratic, and several of them appeared to be injured. Dark stains that might have been blood drifted behind them in small clouds of frozen droplets. Their bioluminescent patterns flickered weakly, and their wing beats seemed labored and painful. The lead dragon positioned itself directly in front of the station's main viewing port and looked directly at Marcus through the reinforced glass. Its eyes were ancient and intelligent, filled with a wisdom that spoke of countless years and experiences beyond human understanding. In that moment, Marcus realized that these creatures were not just animals. They were sentient beings, possibly more intelligent than humans themselves. The dragon's mouth opened, revealing rows of crystalline teeth, and it made a sound that the station's external microphones couldn't detect, but that Marcus somehow felt in his bones. The other dragons gathered around their leader, forming a loose circle around the station. They floated there in the vacuum of space, their wings barely moving, waiting for some response from the human inside. Marcus stood frozen at the viewing port, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. Dragons were mythological creatures, stories told by ancient humans to explain things they didn't understand. They didn't exist in real life, and they certainly couldn't survive in the vacuum of space. Yet here they were, clearly real, clearly alive, and clearly in need of help. The red dragon moved closer to the viewing port and pressed one massive claw against the glass. The gesture was gentle, almost pleading. Marcus could see intelligence in its eyes, a desperate hope that the human inside might offer sanctuary to creatures that had nowhere else to go. Marcus realized that the dragons weren't just lost or exploring. They were refugees. Something had driven them from their home, whatever and wherever that might be, and they had traveled across the vast emptiness of space to reach this remote mining station. They were seeking shelter, asking for help in the only way they could. The practical part of Marcus's mind immediately began calculating problems. The station was designed for human habitation, with specific atmospheric requirements and limited space. How could 10 massive dragons possibly fit inside? What did they eat? How did they breathe? Were they dangerous? Could they communicate? But another part of his mind, a part that had been dormant during his years of solitude, responded to the desperate hope in the lead dragon's eyes. These were intelligent beings in distress, far from home and in need of assistance. The fundamental human impulse to help those in need overrode his practical concerns. Marcus placed his hand against the glass where the dragon's claw rested. The creature's eyes widened slightly, and the bioluminescent patterns along its body brightened. Behind it, the other dragons began to move in slow circles, their own patterns pulsing in what seemed like excitement or relief. The red dragon pulled back from the viewing port and gestured with its massive head toward the station's docking bay. The message was clear. They wanted to come inside. Marcus looked at the creatures floating in space around his station and made a decision that would change his life forever. He activated the station's intercom system and spoke aloud, knowing the dragons probably couldn't understand his words, but hoping they might comprehend his tone. "Okay," he said. "I don't know how this is going to work, but I'll figure something out. Welcome to Lunar Station Omega-7. The dragon's bioluminescent patterns flared brightly, and they began to move toward the docking bay in an orderly formation. Marcus hurried to the control room and began the complex process of opening the massive doors that would allow the creatures inside. As he worked, he wondered what he was getting himself into, and whether he would live to regret his decision to help 10 lost dragons who had somehow found their way to his lonely outpost in the darkness of space. The docking bay doors slowly opened, revealing the interior of the station to the creatures waiting outside. The lead dragon entered first, followed by the others in the same formation they had maintained during their approach. As they passed through the atmospheric barrier that kept the station's air inside, Marcus held his breath, wondering if the creatures could survive in the oxygen-nitrogen mixture that kept him alive. To his relief, the dragons seemed to adapt immediately to the station's atmosphere. They settled onto the floor of the docking bay with surprising grace for such massive creatures, folding their wings and arranging themselves in a loose circle. Their bioluminescent patterns continued to pulse gently, and they watched the sealed door that separated them from the rest of the station where Marcus waited. Marcus stared at the monitor showing the docking bay and realized that his quiet, solitary life had just ended. In its place was something he had never experienced before: the responsibility of caring for 10 alien beings who had entrusted him with their lives. He didn't know what challenges lay ahead, but he was certain that nothing would ever be the same again. Communication and discovery. Marcus spent the next several hours studying the dragons through the docking bay's internal cameras, trying to understand what he was dealing with. The creatures had arranged themselves in a perfect circle with the large red dragon at the center, and they remained completely still except for the gentle pulsing of their bioluminescent patterns. Their breathing was slow and steady, creating small clouds of condensation in the cooler air of the docking bay. The station's atmospheric processors were working overtime to maintain proper air quality, with 10 massive creatures now breathing inside the facility. Marcus adjusted the settings to increase oxygen production and added extra filtration to handle whatever gases the dragons might be exhaling. Surprisingly, the air quality readings remained stable, suggesting that the creatures' respiratory systems were compatible with human breathable atmosphere. After ensuring the station's life support could handle the additional load, Marcus began researching everything he could about dragons in human mythology. He accessed the station's extensive database of historical records, folklore, and xenobiology studies. While most of the dragon legends were clearly fictional, he found some interesting patterns in the stories told by different cultures across Earth. Dragons were consistently portrayed as intelligent, long-lived creatures with the ability to communicate telepathically. They were often described as guardians of knowledge or treasure, beings of immense power who chose to help or hinder humans based on how they were treated. Many cultures spoke of dragons as creatures from other realms or dimensions, visitors from places beyond normal space and time. Marcus wondered if there might be some truth to these ancient stories. Perhaps humans had encountered dragons before, in Earth's distant past, and the memories had been preserved as mythology. It would explain how creatures that looked exactly like legendary dragons had ended up in space, seeking shelter from a human mining station. The practical problems of housing 10 dragons were significant. The docking bay was the only space on the station large enough to hold them all, but it wasn't designed for long-term habitation. There were no sleeping areas, no food storage, and limited environmental controls. Marcus would need to modify the space if the dragons were going to stay for any extended period. More immediately, he needed to establish some form of communication with the creatures. The red dragon had clearly understood that Marcus was the station's inhabitant and had made gestures that suggested intelligence and purpose. If they could find a way to communicate, Marcus might be able to learn where the dragons had come from, why they needed shelter, and how long they intended to stay. Marcus decided to make direct contact. He sealed himself into an environmental suit just in case the dragons proved hostile or carried unknown pathogens, and entered the docking bay through the maintenance airlock. The moment he stepped into the chamber, all 10 dragons turned their massive heads to look at him. Up close, the creatures were even more impressive than they had appeared on the monitors. The smallest of them was still larger than Marcus, and the red leader was easily 3 times his height, even when lying down. Their scales weren't just decorative, they seemed to serve as some form of biomechanical interface, with tiny filaments that moved constantly across their surfaces like living circuits. The red dragon slowly raised its head and looked directly at Marcus. Its eyes were deep amber with flecks of gold, and they held an intelligence that was unmistakably sentient. The creature made a soft rumbling sound that Marcus felt as much as heard, a vibration that seemed to resonate through his body. Marcus had prepared for this moment by deciding to keep his approach simple and non-threatening. He slowly raised his hand in what he hoped was a universal gesture of greeting, then placed it over his heart and said clearly, "Marcus." He repeated the gesture and his name several times, hoping the dragon would understand that he was identifying himself. The red dragon tilted its massive head and studied Marcus for a long moment. Then, to Marcus's amazement, it carefully raised one enormous claw and touched its own chest, making the same rumbling sound 3 times. The sound was clearly meant to be its name, though Marcus couldn't quite reproduce the complex harmonics with his human vocal cords. Encouraged by this success, Marcus began a slow process of establishing basic communication. He pointed to himself and said human, then gestured to the dragons and raised his eyebrows in a questioning expression. The red dragon seemed to understand and made a different sound, longer and more musical than its name. The other dragons responded with variations of the same sound, confirming that this was their species' designation. Over the next few hours, Marcus and the red dragon worked together to establish a basic vocabulary of gestures and sounds. The dragon was remarkably quick to understand Marcus's intentions, and it began to reciprocate with its own attempts at communication. The creature's intelligence was clearly superior to human average, and it seemed to possess an intuitive understanding of language concepts that allowed it to grasp Marcus's meaning even when his gestures were clumsy. The other dragons watched this exchange with obvious interest, their bioluminescent patterns pulsing in complex sequences that Marcus began to recognize as their own form of communication. The patterns seemed to convey emotional states and simple concepts, with different colors and rhythms corresponding to different meanings. The dragons could apparently communicate among themselves without making sounds, using only the light displays that covered their bodies. During a break in the communication exercises, Marcus noticed that several of the dragons appeared to be injured. Dark stains on their scales had dried into crystalline formations that looked like frozen blood, and some of them moved with obvious discomfort. The green dragon in particular seemed to be having trouble with one of its wings, keeping it folded awkwardly against its body. Marcus pointed to the injured dragons and made what he hoped were concerned expressions and gestures. The red dragon followed his gaze and made a low, mournful sound. It then began a complex sequence of gestures and light patterns that seemed to tell a story. Through careful observation and patient repetition, Marcus began to understand what had happened to the dragons. They had come from somewhere far away, a place that the red dragon indicated by pointing toward deep space. Something had attacked them there, something the dragon represented with harsh, aggressive gestures and dark red light patterns that made all the dragons recoil. The dragons had fled their home, traveling through space for what seemed like a very long time. Several of them had been injured in the attack, and they had been searching for somewhere safe to rest and heal. The red dragon's gestures suggested that they had detected the station's energy signature and had hoped to find sanctuary here. Marcus realized that these creatures were not just lost travelers, but refugees from some kind of war or disaster. They had risked everything to escape from whatever had threatened them, and they had no safe place to return to. His decision to let them into the station might have literally saved their lives. The weight of this responsibility was overwhelming. Marcus was just one human, alone on a mining station in the middle of nowhere. He had no training in xenobiology, no experience with first contact protocols, and no way to contact Earth for guidance without revealing the dragon's presence. The nearest human settlement was weeks away even by the fastest ships, and any attempt to seek help would likely result in the dragons being captured and studied by government scientists. But looking at the injured creatures huddled in his docking bay, Marcus knew he couldn't abandon them. They had trusted him enough to come aboard his station, and they clearly had nowhere else to go. Whatever their story was, whatever had driven them from their home, they needed his help to survive. Marcus began making plans to better accommodate his unexpected guests. The docking bay could be modified to serve as a temporary habitat, with improved environmental controls and basic amenities. He could set up medical equipment to treat their injuries, using the station's automated surgical systems adapted for their larger physiology. Food might be a challenge, but the station had hydroponic gardens and protein synthesis equipment that could potentially be modified to produce suitable nutrition. Most importantly, he needed to continue developing communication with the dragons. If they were going to coexist on the station, they would need to understand each other's needs and limitations. The Red Dragon had already shown remarkable intelligence and adaptability, and Marcus suspected that the other dragons possessed similar capabilities. As the station's artificial day cycle began to dim into evening, the dragons settled into what appeared to be sleep positions. They arranged themselves in their circle formation, with their heads pointing inward and their wings folded protectively around their bodies. The bioluminescent patterns faded to a soft glow that provided just enough light to see by. Marcus returned to his quarters and spent the night reviewing everything he knew about biology, linguistics, and engineering. He had a feeling that the next few days would test every skill he had ever learned. 10 alien refugees were depending on him for their survival, and he was determined not to let them down. The morning brought new challenges and new discoveries. Marcus woke to find that the dragons had somehow reorganized the docking bay during the night, using their combined strength to move heavy equipment and create a more comfortable living space. They had also discovered the station's waste disposal system and had figured out how to use it properly, showing a remarkable ability to adapt to human technology. The Red Dragon greeted Marcus with what seemed to be enthusiasm, making happy rumbling sounds and flashing bright patterns across its scales. It had apparently spent the night thinking about their communication problems, because it immediately began a new series of gestures that were more complex and nuanced than anything it had attempted before. Marcus realized that his lonely life of mining and solitude was over. In its place was something far more challenging but also far more rewarding: the chance to be humanity's first ambassador to an entirely new species, and perhaps to forge a friendship that would change both human and dragon civilization forever. The bond forged. 3 weeks had passed since the dragon's arrival, and Lunar Station Omega-7 had been transformed into something no human engineer had ever imagined. The docking bay now resembled a carefully designed habitat, with modified environmental controls maintaining perfect temperature and humidity for the dragon's comfort. Marcus had reprogrammed the station's manufacturing systems to produce specialized furniture scaled to dragon proportions, and the creatures had arranged their living space with an aesthetic sense that spoke of advanced civilization. Communication between Marcus and the dragons had progressed far beyond basic gestures. The Red Dragon, whom Marcus had started calling Crimson in his logs, had demonstrated an remarkable ability to learn human language concepts. Through patient repetition and increasingly sophisticated exchanges, they had developed a hybrid communication system that combined human words, dragon sounds, and the complex bioluminescent patterns that served as the dragon's natural language. Marcus had learned that the dragons possessed names for themselves that were impossible for human vocal cords to reproduce exactly, but he had worked with each of them to create approximations that both species could manage. Crimson led the group, but the others each had distinct personalities and roles within their small community. Azure was a healer. Verdant specialized in what seemed to be botanical knowledge. Aurelius understood technology in ways that amazed Marcus, and the others each brought their own unique skills and perspectives. The dragon's intelligence continued to astound Marcus. They learned to operate human technology with minimal instruction, quickly mastering the station's computer interfaces, and even suggesting improvements to various systems. Aurelius, in particular, had shown an intuitive understanding of the station's power distribution network and had helped Marcus optimize efficiency in ways that the original designers had never considered. But it was their emotional intelligence that truly impressed him. The dragons seemed to understand human psychology better than many humans did, and they had quickly adapted their behavior to make Marcus feel comfortable around them. They were gentle with their massive strength, careful not to damage equipment or accidentally harm their human host. They had even developed what appeared to be a sense of humor, playing harmless pranks and engaging in behavior that could only be described as playful. The injured dragons had healed rapidly under Azure's care, and with the help of the station's medical equipment that Marcus had modified for their use. The healing process had given Marcus his first glimpse of dragon technology, as Azure had produced crystalline devices that seemed to accelerate natural healing and reduce scarring. The technology was unlike anything in human science, operating on principles that Marcus could observe but not fully understand. During their recovery, the dragons had begun sharing their story with Marcus in greater detail. Through a combination of words, images displayed on their scales, and complex light patterns, they painted a picture of a civilization far older and more advanced than humanity. The dragons came from a region of space that human astronomers had never explored, where their people had lived in harmony with their environment for millions of years. The attack that had driven them from their home had come without warning. An aggressive species that the dragons called the Devourers had swept through their territory, destroying everything in their path and consuming the life force of entire planets. The dragons' peaceful civilization had been unprepared for such violence, and most of their people had been killed or captured before they could organize an effective defense. Crimson and the 9 other dragons were survivors from a research station that had been studying ancient technologies when the attack began. They had managed to escape using an experimental faster-than-light drive that had brought them across vast distances to this remote part of the galaxy. But the drive had been damaged during their escape, and they were stranded far from home with no way to return or contact other survivors. Marcus found himself deeply moved by their story. These beings had lost everything: their families, their civilization, their entire way of life. They were refugees in the truest sense, carrying only their knowledge and their hope for survival. That they had chosen to trust a lone human with their lives spoke to either desperation or a remarkable ability to recognize compassion across species barriers. As the days passed, Marcus began to understand that the dragons possessed knowledge that could revolutionize human science. Their understanding of energy manipulation, biotechnology, and space travel was centuries ahead of human achievement. Aurelius had already shown him improvements to the station's fusion reactors that increased efficiency by 40% while reducing radiation output to negligible levels. But the dragons seemed reluctant to share their more advanced technologies. Through careful questioning, Marcus learned that they had encountered other species in their travels across the galaxy, and not all of those encounters had been positive. Some civilizations had tried to capture and enslave dragons for their knowledge, while others had attempted to steal their technology through force or deception. The dragons were clearly evaluating Marcus and humanity as a whole, trying to determine whether humans could be trusted with advanced technology. They watched his behavior carefully, testing his reactions to various situations, and observing how he treated them and maintained the station. Marcus realized that he was essentially undergoing an extended job interview for the entire human race. The test came sooner than he expected. 3 weeks after the dragon's arrival, the station's long-range sensors detected an approaching spacecraft. The vessel was traveling at high speed and would reach the station within hours. Marcus's first instinct was relief. He could contact Earth, report the dragon's presence, and get expert help in dealing with the situation. But when he shared the news with Crimson, the dragon's reaction was immediate and alarming. The bioluminescent patterns on its scales flashed urgent warnings, and it made distressed sounds that brought all the other dragons to full alertness. Through rapid gestures and light displays, Crimson communicated that the approaching ship was not human. Marcus checked the sensor readings more carefully and realized that Crimson was correct. The vessel's energy signature didn't match any known human technology, and its configuration was unlike anything in Earth's spacecraft databases. Worse, the ship was broadcasting what appeared to be scanning signals, systematic sweeps that suggested it was searching for something specific. The dragons huddled together in obvious fear, their patterns dim and subdued. Crimson explained through urgent communication that the ship belonged to the same species that had attacked their homeworld. The Devourers had somehow tracked them across the galaxy and had come to finish what they had started. Marcus faced the most important decision of his life. He could surrender the dragons to their pursuers, saving himself and the station from potential destruction. The attacking species clearly possessed superior technology and would likely destroy the station anyway if he tried to resist. Logically, there was no way 1 human and 10 injured dragons could stand against enemies who had conquered an entire civilization. But Marcus looked at the creatures who had trusted him with their lives, who had shared their knowledge and their friendship with him despite their fear and trauma. These beings had shown him wonders beyond human imagination and had treated him with kindness and respect. The idea of betraying them was unthinkable. Marcus activated the station's defensive systems, such as they were. Lunar Station Omega-7 had been built for mining, not warfare, but it possessed basic shields and a few weapon systems designed to destroy dangerous asteroids. Against military spacecraft, the defenses would be useless, but Marcus was determined to make a fight of it. Crimson approached Marcus as he worked at the defense controls and placed a massive claw gently on his shoulder. The dragon's eyes held gratitude and something that looked like pride. Through their shared communication system, Crimson conveyed a simple message. The dragons would not forget Marcus's courage, no matter what happened. But the dragons had not survived millions of years of civilization by being helpless. As the enemy ship approached weapons range, Aurelius began making complex adjustments to the station's power systems, while the other dragons took positions around the docking bay. Their bioluminescent patterns synchronized into a brilliant display that seemed to pulse with gathering energy. Marcus watched in amazement as the dragons began to change before his eyes. Their scales brightened until they blazed like miniature suns, and energy began to crackling between their claws. The peaceful refugees he had been caring for revealed themselves to be beings of immense power, capable of channeling forces that human science could barely measure. When the enemy ship opened fire, expecting to destroy a helpless mining station, it instead encountered a coordinated defense that combined human engineering with dragon power. The station's shields, enhanced by the dragon's energy manipulation, absorbed attacks that should have been devastating. The mining lasers, amplified through dragon biotechnology, struck back with precision that surprised the attackers. But the real shock came when Crimson and the other dragons revealed their ultimate capability. Working together, they opened what appeared to be a rift in space itself, a gateway that connected the station to some distant location. Through the portal came reinforcements, dragons from hidden refuges throughout the galaxy, survivors who had been waiting for a signal that it was safe to reveal themselves. The battle was brief and decisive. The attacking ship, faced with dozens of dragons wielding technologies beyond its understanding, retreated into faster-than-light travel and disappeared. The refugees were no longer alone, and their enemies now knew that the dragons were not as defenseless as they had believed. In the aftermath of the battle, as dragon reinforcements secured the area and began establishing a permanent presence in the system, Marcus found himself at the center of a historic moment. Humanity had just made first contact with an advanced alien civilization, not through government channels or military might, but through the simple act of one human showing kindness to creatures in need. Crimson approached Marcus as the other dragons began preparations for converting the asteroid field around the station into a hidden base of operations. The dragon's message was clear. Marcus had proven that humanity could be trusted with dragon knowledge and technology. The isolated species that had conquered the galaxy through compassion and wisdom were ready to share their gifts with a younger race that showed similar virtues. But the partnership would be gradual and carefully managed. Not all humans would react well to the sudden appearance of dragons, and not all dragons were ready to trust after their recent losses. Marcus would serve as the first human ambassador, working with a select group of dragons to slowly introduce the two species and begin the long process of building a lasting alliance. Marcus looked out at the transformed mining station, now bustling with dragon activity as advanced technology converted raw space into a sophisticated installation. His years of solitude were definitely over, replaced by a responsibility he had never imagined, helping to bridge the gap between two intelligent species and forge a friendship that could reshape the future of the galaxy. The 10 stray dragons who had sought shelter at his station had brought him far more than he could have ever expected. They had brought him purpose, friendship, and a chance to be part of something larger than himself. Most importantly, they had shown him that the universe was full of wonders, waiting to be discovered by those brave enough to open their doors to the unknown. As Crimson settled beside him to watch the sunset through the station's viewing ports, Marcus realized that his greatest adventure was just beginning. The galaxy was vast and full of possibilities, and he now had the most remarkable companions imaginable to help him explore it. The lonely human and the 10 dragons had become something neither species could have achieved alone, a symbol of hope for peaceful coexistence among the stars.